everyone, my name is Ariana Bieber and I'm going to be discussing women's history through the historiography of Spanish Mexican women in Frontier, California. I'm going to begin this project by talking about the early histories of Mexican women in California. Up until the mid-1970s, historians really wanted to keep the ideology of the inferiority of the Mexican race to that of their Anglo-Christian counterparts. Mexican women's roles were being compared to that of white women's roles in society. So Mexican culture and the roles that women had within that culture were being looked at and perceived through a white lens. To understand how these ideologies became intertwined with the history of California, we must go through the historiography. The first historian to become an integral part of the historiography of women in California is Hubert Howe Bancroft, pictured above. Bancroft and his associates, Theodore H. Hiddle and Zoe Skinner Eldridge, pictured below, were post-Civil War historians who wanted to create a nationalistic view of history. Their main agenda was to prove that society as a whole was failing in California due to Mexican men. As you can see in this quote, Bancroft is stating that Mexican men are halfway between a proud Castilian and a lowly root digger, and halfway between savagery and civilization. Though women were not an integral part of their research, they did use women as a tool to continually perpetuate the idea that Mexican men were a low part of society. Bancroft is stated as saying that Mexican women were dunces and drudges, and they bear between 12, 15, and 20 children, and are subject to being prostituted by their husbands. As you can see by that quote, they're stating that Mexican men were violent and hated their wives. And by perpetuating that, they essentially stated that when white settlers came, they were seen as their heroes, perpetuating the myth of the white hero. The second shift in the historiography is that of Teutonic historians. Now, though they barely mention women in their studies, they mostly focused on the political institutions, the pivotal structures perceived by both as the sources of the nation's order and coherence, and the hallmarks that distinguishes one civilization from the other. Now, it might not seem that they are important when it comes to the historiography of women, but they actually continued the perpetuation that Bancroft and his historians started. It was done by Frederick Jackson Turner, who is pictured to the side, but he focused more on the New World, comparing civilizations in Europe and America. Now, because he was seeing how the New World affected Caucasians when they came here, he pretty much left out women and non-Caucasians because to him, they were not active participants in the creation of democratic institutions. Now, he did something a little bit differently. He separated Spanish and Mexican women, while others had put them together. So he viewed Spanish women as being very modest and moral, and that's probably because of their European connections. Now, he viewed Mexican women as nothing more than basic prostitutes, and like their male counterparts, deserved to be wiped out. He's also responsible for the Spanish heritage fantasy. Now, that's stuff that you see even now in films and in books, the kind of grandiose of Spanish heritage and the beauty of it. The fourth shift we want to look at in the historiography was created by Hubert Eugene Bolton. Now, he wanted to create a new school approach to the historiography, so thus creating the Spanish Borderland School. The Boltonian school of thought wanted to change the narrative of the historiography by showing that Spanish institutions, like the missions, did not fail. But much like his predecessors, Bolton did leave women out of the scholarship, believing that they did not contribute anything to the history. Now, though it may not seem like he is important to the historiography, he did report on the relationships that women had to the men who formed California, so like governors' wives. And one of the women he principally brought up a lot in his works was that of Eulalia Calles, who was the wife of a governor. Now, even though he brought her up, he mostly discussed her and her scandalous behavior and the problems she caused within the missionaries. He also discussed the women who were in the mission. Now, the last scholarship we want to look at is the New Scholarship. Now, this was a direct result of the Chicano movement in the 1960s and 70s. So, historians and activists wanted to revisit the sexual violence and brutality enacted on women. For them, they claimed that all of this violence enacted on women was that of domination. It was domination of white settlers over Mexican people. They also wanted to give agency in the political and cultural dynamics within the Spanish colonies and Mexican law policies. They wanted to look at how women had a pivotal role in the creations of the culture. They also wanted to show that because of everything that women had gone through, and even the interracial marriages between Mexicans, Spaniards, in Native Americans, as well as a couple of other cultures, that it helped develop these Chicano urban communities that we see today. Now, after all of this historiography, we are left with the question, why? Why is it important that we look at the history of Mexican women in California? As you can see, I have a bunch of pictures to the side. Those are all members of my family. My great-grandmother, great-aunt, and my grandmother were all immigrants from Mexico to California. So for me, it's personal. It's important for me that the stories and agency of women from Mexico to California are given, because they mostly are forgotten. And there is still a lack of new scholarship, even with the new school approach. And because there is a lack of new scholarship, it allows for the continual perpetuation of racial stereotypes created by early historians.